Hello and welcome to Your Coaching Journey, a podcast for doctors about coaching. Whether you're a coaching doctor, a doctor who is learning to coach, or a doctor who would like to build coaching into your professional life, then this is the podcast for you. Hello, I'm Helen Leathers, and with me today is my co-host and business partner, Tom Dillon. Hi Tom, how are you today?
I'm very well, thank you very much. How are you?
I'm good, thank you.
Good.
I'm really looking forward to discussing today's issue that might arise in the coaching room. So what are we talking about today?
Today we are talking about people pleasing.
Oh.
So this is something that often comes up in the coaching room, and quite often, I will hear this from clients as a throwaway comment that I'm a people pleaser. And that's fine up to a point, but it can have big consequences for our coachees. So that's what we're going to be exploring.
Okay, so let's get started then with what is people pleasing?
Well, apart from a very catchy tune by Cat Burns, people pleasing, actually, it's not called people, it's called people pleaser. I'm a people pleaser. That's kind of the refrain. It's a pattern of behaviour that many of us will identify with, and which generally sees us just trying to please other people. It does what it says on the tin. So we are, doing what other people want us to do, really. And maybe they haven't even told us that, but we will do things in order to please others. So for me, the origins of this term come from transactional analysis. That's where it stems. Now, I have no real evidence that there was nothing before that, but that's the first awareness I have it. So transactional analysis emerged in the late 50s, early 60s. Eric Berne was the founder of that type of therapy, and it really looked at childhood messaging and the influence that our childhood has on us as we develop and as we go into adulthood. So many people will be aware of this because the drama triangle comes from, I know the drama triangle is talked about a lot with doctors, that idea that we have a persecutor, a victim and a rescuer in a drama that's going on in certain situations. So that's Eric Berne's world. Also the parent adult child model is an Eric Berne model. This idea of people pleasing is one of 5 drivers that another transactional analysis creator came up with. And the drivers, they're very different, but 5 drivers are: be strong, hurry up, please others, be perfect, and try hard. Okay, so they're quite different ways of being, but they all stem from this idea of us having a life script that develops between the ages of 2 and 7. So in those early years, we will learn how to be in the world, and we'll develop a script that might well stay with us for the rest of our life, unless we start to examine it and explore it and try and unpick it a little bit. So, and this is all about how we navigate our world as a child. So if we have quite a chaotic, disruptive household where we have to understand how to be and how we're going to be comfortable in that world, it might be that pleasing others is our way of adapting in order to thrive, be well in that world and be okay in that world. And one of the concepts that comes from transactional analysis is that being okay, the idea of being okay. And it can quite easily develop that the only way that we can be okay is to please others. So you can imagine that if we've been told by our parents that you have to be nice, you have to be good, you have to do as you're told. You have to share. And if we've been told that, and then we go to school and we're told that we have to get along with everyone else and do what we're told and just please others, and it's selfish to do what you want to do when other things are going on, we can quite easily develop that idea that that's how you have to be in life. In order to be okay, you have to please others. And the consequence of adopting that script is that if we don't please others, we might well see ourselves as not okay. So we might see ourselves as being unworthy of love and affection, and unworthy of other people's respect, unless we're doing what they want us to do, or pleasing others in some way. So it can run really deep. Now, that's one theory. There might be other explanations for why this comes about, but if we have that deep-rooted childhood messaging that we've carried through with us into adulthood, that can be really problematic in terms of people pleasing.
This is fascinating, and it's kind of bringing bells with me in terms of one of my pet hates are the memes that say, you know, do your self-care so that you can give more to other people. And my thing is, well, do self-care so you're okay. And why would you only look after yourself in order to give all your energy away to someone else? But it sounds like that's tapping into that people-pleasing driver.
Yeah, and you know, I think a lot of doctors will have this people-pleasing, looking after others, putting everyone first before themselves, and that's part of the reason why doctors end up with burnout, because they are constantly saying yes to people and just giving constantly. So and I think we talked about the 5 drivers, and I think the other 2 that tend to come along with that for doctors is the be perfect driver. So that, you know, they've gone through their education being excelling at education. So they've been perfect, they've got top marks, they go on to university, go on to medical school. They follow that path and they've had to be perfect to get as far as they do. So they take that with them into their role as a doctor. And also the be strong script. So if they've got that as well, so if you think about those 3, so they never have time off ill because they're pleasing other people and they're trying to be strong and they don't want to be seen not to be coping. And again, I think their medical training, where they have to do crazy hours and work under intense pressure, only the strong survive. So they're taught that they have to be strong.
Sounds like a recipe for disaster.
So you've got people pleasing, you've got being strong, and you've got being perfect. And if you're trying to do all 3, that's a recipe for burnout.
Definitely. Wow. So obviously burnout could be something that people come to the coaching room for, but how else does people pleasing show up in the coaching room?
Yeah, as I say, I think often it is just a throwaway comment. And it might be that if someone's going, well, I'm a bit of a people pleaser, it might not be a big issue, but it might be that the issue is just being disguised. That you know, they are overcommitting and they're not actually doing what they want to do because of this people-pleasing tendency. So even though it might be just a throwaway line, I think it's worth pausing the coaching at that point and just saying, oh, you mentioned people-pleasing. Tell me about that. How does that show up for you?
And of course, if it's showing up in the workplace, the likelihood is it's going to be showing up in home life as well.
Yeah.
So you've got potential for pressure from both sides.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, it's not going to be just one arena that it shows up. People are going to have this as a general way of being, and if I don't please others, I'm not going to be okay. So some of the other ways that it shows up is an excessive need for approval. So they might constantly need that affirmation that they're doing the right thing and that people like them, so they'll constantly be seeking that validation. And they'll have difficulty saying no. So when they're asked to do something, you know, cover a shift or whatever it is, they are likely to go, oh yeah, that's fine, in the moment without thinking about it. So they'll just say yes and then perhaps go away and be disgruntled that they have overcommitted themselves again. So saying no, difficulty saying no is something that will show up. And I think we can all relate to coachees showing up saying, oh, I can't say no.
And we've talked about boundaries before, haven't we?
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah. Avoidance of conflict. So the people pleasers tend to want a harmonious life. So they tend to keep away from conflict. They don't want to go there. So they might avoid difficult conversations.
Isn't it funny how people conflate those two, conflict and difficult conversations?
Yeah.
A topic for another time.
It is a topic for another time. And there's a lovely model by Thomas and Kilman of the negotiation styles or conflict styles that people have. And at one end you've got competing and at the other end you've got accommodating. And so a people pleaser's natural negotiation style is to accommodate. So people say, oh, well, I want you to do this. Oh, yeah, that's fine. And that's the weakest position you can be in terms of negotiation. You have no power in that situation if you're just doing exactly what the other person asks you to do. So obviously, if we've got that, the need for approval, we've got a difficulty saying no, we've got an avoidance of conflict, that's going to result in people overcommitting and overextending themselves. So they're just going to take on more and more responsibility in all directions, so home life, work life, everywhere they turn. They go, oh yeah, that's fine.
So someone could show up with a problem around their work-life balance or perhaps lack of self-care, not doing the things they want to do for themselves.
Yeah, just not having any space in their life. Because, like I say, it's not necessarily work-life balance, because actually they're probably just as committed in their personal lives They're saying yes to everything in their personal life. So they probably end up doing all the housework just to please everyone else. So that's another area that will show up. As you say, neglecting self-care. They'll be prioritising others rather than themselves. And just fearing disapproval and rejection. So they might live in constant fear that if they don't please others, that they will be rejected or people will disapprove of them.
Interesting.
Yeah. So that's how we're likely to see it in the coaching room.
So how do you start to work with a client who thinks that their people pleasing is having an impact on their life in some way?
I think just recognising it. So rather than just accepting their flippant, I'm a people pleaser, actually stopping to explore that and saying, well, what does that actually mean for you? And what are the consequences of you being a people pleaser? When you're saying yes to something, what are you saying no to?
Because often people will say, I'm a people pleaser in a way that means that's it. I'm always going to be a people pleaser. It's an absolute, it can't change.
Yeah, so back to when we did the cognitive behavioural approach to coaching, it was all about that overgeneralisation. And this is one way of expressing that, isn't it? To say, I'm a people pleaser, I can't possibly be any other way. That means I can't say no to things. That means I won't have arguments. I don't like conflict. That means I like the harmony. So it's difficult for them to think of another way of being. And it's almost like owning it, isn't it? It's a label that they carry with themselves. Well, I'm a people pleaser, that's just how I am.
End of story.
I fully accept that these things are deep rooted, and if we take that transactional analysis approach, that it has come from childhood, they've got years of conditioning and years of being that way. So to stop and pause and try and be a different way is going to take some effort. So recognising that it's not going to be easy is also something to bear in mind. So I suppose exploring why they do it. What's the gain for them in being a people pleaser? Now it might be that they get some secondary gain into the sense of feeling good about themselves. I'm a nice person because I do what everyone else wants me to do. But I think also exploring what they give up by doing it.
What the consequences are.
Yeah. I guess once we get beyond that and we understand that there are consequences, what strategies that they could adopt in order to be able to perhaps say no, in order to be assertive in a conversation where there is some negotiation to be had. There might be that someone's asking them to cover a shift, and they might, rather than just saying yes, they might say, yeah, I'm happy to do that, but I want some compromise. I want next Tuesday off if I cover that shift. So it's just being ready to, and that's quite a nice way to think about it, as a negotiation rather than just, well, that's how I am. Think, okay, what are my different strategies that I could adopt in this? And maybe compromise is like a step along the way, rather than saying, well, no, I'm not doing it. Just, well, I could do it, but I want this in return. So just trying out different strategies, different ways of being. We talked about boundaries, so putting some boundaries in place, knowing what it is you want and knowing what you're not prepared to go back on. So I have in my calendar, every week I pick my grandson up from school. So 3:20, I'm there at the school gate. That doesn't change. So if I'm asked to do a piece of work, I'll do it any other time of the week, but on Friday afternoons, I'm not going to do it. That's just a boundary in my diary. That's what's happening.
It's something you told me when I first met you.
There you go.
That's a boundary in my
changed.
diary. That's not changing.
And as long as he wants me to pick him up from school, I'll keep doing it. I'm sure there will, not too distant future, there'll come a time where he doesn't want his granddad picking him up from school. But for the moment, that's kind of a boundary in my diary. So I think learning to set some boundaries and sticking to them, knowing that you can stick to them, is important. That builds in some self-efficacy. If you can do it in a small way like that, okay, that's my boundary. Every Friday I'm there at 3:20. You can think, well, I can do that. I can put other boundaries in place as well. So recognising you have that ability to put boundaries in place, and recognising that the world doesn't end. So any client or anyone else that wants my time on a Friday afternoon that I've said no to, no one has ever said, well, that's terrible. How can you do that? You need to see me on Friday afternoon. No one ever says that. So that's just a boundary that I have. So recognising that it's not the end of the world. I'm still okay if I say no to someone around that. And I think I have a little bit of a people pleaser mentality. I think I do like a quiet life. I like a bit of harmony. I like things to
Well, no one
tick
wants
along.
to invite conflict into their life.
Some people do.
Maybe.
So, and if you've got that be strong script, if that's part of your I'm only okay if I'm strong, you absolutely will have conflict because
that's
you want your way to be the way it is. So I think, learning how to negotiate perhaps is a good way to think about it too.
It sounds as though, much like imposter syndrome that we talked about in episode 11, a cognitive behavioural approach could help with some of these things.
Yes, it could well do in terms of working out what those strategies are for new behaviours. So maybe it is about someone challenging themselves to actually say no, or challenging themselves to negotiate around their time, to get something back for themselves. So there are all sorts of ways in which you might do that. And so we talked earlier about the origins of it and that transactional analysis approach. And I think some of the work that I do around that approach is about recognising that it's okay. The coachee is still okay if they go against that driver that they have. So if they have a please others driver, it's going to feel uncomfortable for them. And they might start to think, I'm really not okay if I don't please others. That makes me a bit feeling unsafe. So I think it's all about giving yourself permission to maybe please yourself. So rather than please others, just to create some boundaries, just giving yourself permission. Now, I don't feel like it's my gift to give people permission. I'm just their coach, but I think they have it within themselves to give themselves permission to please themselves rather than pleasing others all the time. So I think there's that element to it that if we understand the origins of it and they sit really deeply, and it's years of conditioning, that actually some behavioural approaches might not work straight away. So it might take some time just to embed those new ways of being, and for people to recognise, well, no, the world didn't end, and I am still okay, and I am still worthy of love and affection. That might be a way forward, but it might take some time. So it's not necessarily a quick fix. I think sometimes with the cognitive behavioural approach, it's okay, we'll do this. Write your affirmations every day for 3 weeks and everything will be fine. And I think some things that sit much deeper, but we can still work with them.
And we'll be exploring transactional analysis in another episode in the future.
Yes.
Brilliant. This is really insightful and I'm sure really helpful to lots of people. What one tip would you give a coach who has a client that mentions people pleasing in a session?
I think just not to ignore it. Notice what you're noticing. So if someone just has that flippant throwaway, I'm a people pleaser, don't let it go by without picking up on it and exploring it with them. So you mentioned being a people pleaser. What does that mean to you? What are the consequences of you being a people pleaser? How does that show up in your life? Questions like that can really draw out what's going on for them and how life is as a people pleaser and whether they're happy with it. And if they're perfectly happy with it, that's fine, isn't it? But there will be consequences, and it may be that they are unhappy with the way they're living their life because they're a people pleaser. Yes,
and I think sometimes those flippant responses can definitely be hiding a deeper issue.
Yeah, sometimes that's a mask, isn't it, that they're wearing just to, so they don't have to have that conversation that's a little bit difficult.
Yes. This is absolutely fantastic. Something I think that we all need to be curious about ourselves. So asking, are we a people pleaser? And perhaps exploring some of those questions for ourselves, and just finding out, as we feel our way, finding out what little changes we can make.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think certainly worth exploring in the coaching room and just looking for those strategies to help someone overcome that tendency. I'd say we've got those 5 different drivers, and we'll be exploring some of those others in the future as well.
Thank you, Tom, for going through people pleasing. Next time on the podcast, we'll be answering some more of our listeners' questions. So if you have anything you'd like to ask us about coaching, please do get in touch. There are more details of how to do that in our show notes. We'll see you next time. Bye for now.
Bye-bye.
This has been a Monkey Pants Productions podcast.